Welcome to Procurious's Bravo podcast series, celebrating women in procurement. I'm Hugo Bridd, Content Director for Procurious, and I'm delighted to be a part of this series sponsored by Telstra, featuring inspirational stories and career tips from 5 women with some very valuable advice to share. Nicky Abdinor is an international keynote speaker, registered clinical psychologist, and founder of the non-profit Nicky's Drive. She is based in Cape Town, South Africa, where she runs her clinical practice. Nicky, thank you for joining us today. Nicky, when you walked onto the stage at the Sydney Big Ideas Summit, the audience could immediately see that you're the embodiment of someone who inspires by doing more with less. Now, this podcast is obviously audio only, so could you please describe your disability for our listeners and tell us how you rose to the challenge throughout your childhood and later life?
Yes, well, I always like to say that I was born without arms, but not without attitude. So when I was born, I have a physical disability, which is that I have no arms and I have shortened legs. And my parents, they were not prepared at all for my disability. I might be giving away my age a bit, but back in those days, there were no scans to tell your parents whether you were going to be a boy or a girl, let alone if you had a physical disability. But I always say that I'm so grateful to my parents that they chose to focus on my strengths. So it was never the case of, can Nicky do something? It always was, well, how is Nicky going to be able to do this? So I definitely believe that that kind of nurturing environment helped me adapt to my disability and certainly flourish. So I feel like a big part of my success in life is having that nurturing family environment and also having access to mainstream schooling. So when I went to school, it wasn't the norm for a child with a disability to go to mainstream school. But I think if you're at the Big Ideas Summit and you see some of the video footage when I was little, you'll see that I had also a very determined personality, and I was so persevered and really rose above my physical challenges that I think the school embraced me, and I'm really grateful to have that opportunity. So I think those are the kinds of things that helped me get to where I am today, and I was always encouraged to take part in all activities. I've just always learned to do things a little bit differently. And naturally, as I grew older, I had to change my mindset and realize that maybe I can't do everything the same as everybody else on a physical level, but I could use my advantage, which is my academic abilities, and I love engaging with people. And I think that's really what led me to a career in clinical psychology and also international speaking.
Apply the concept of focusing on what you can do rather than what you can't do to the business world. So where do you see managers and other professionals making mistakes in this respect, and what can they do about it?
Well, I do see a huge improvement in the case of businesses understanding the importance of diversity and inclusion. So in my mind, managers and company owners, they're really starting to take on this premise that having a more diverse workforce is really to their advantage. And, you know, my main focus in life is to teach people to focus on their strengths and focus on what they can do. And if we think about work teams that all have the same strengths, I feel like that's not a diverse workforce. So I think that that's where companies sometimes go wrong, is that they want teams to excel at absolutely everything. And the reality is that we can't all be the best or be good at everything. So I think what managers need to really do is take a look at their teams and find out what strengths each person has and what limitations each person has, because it's not only about focusing on your strengths, but also acknowledging what some of your weaknesses or limitations might be. And that's the best way to get a team to flourish and move forward, is to embrace that diversity, embrace the changes, and make sure that people are doing what they're best at. if we recognize that sometimes a limitation can actually even be a strength in a team. I mean, there's a lot of work around recognizing that people on the autism spectrum disorder even have certain strengths, whereas maybe in the past they weren't encouraged to be part of a workforce. But now people are recognizing that that kind of a disability can have such strength in a company, because people with autism spectrum disorder really have such fine attention to detail. And I mean, that can be such an advantage. So I think that managers are starting to learn that if they're going to have the same team and everybody's strong at everything, I mean, that creates also problems within the communication patterns and leadership struggles. So embrace diversity, focus on people's strengths, and accept that everybody has their own limitations, and just really try and embrace that culture of acceptance and recognizing that we mustn't ignore what's wrong, but we must always focus more on what is right.
Nicky, when you're not inspiring conference audiences, you're a clinical psychologist. So can you tell us how people can create sustainable change in their attitudes and emotions? And what's the link with cognitive behavioral therapy?
Well, for me, I feel like I'm so lucky to be able to be doing two types of work and using some of the same skills. In my work as a clinical psychologist, I mostly focus on cognitive behavioral therapy, and those lessons certainly translate onto stage when I give a presentation. The basic premise of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is to say that it's not our situation that determines how we feel or how we behave, but it's actually how we think about those situations. And the reason for that is to recognize that so many of us could be in exactly the same situation, but we all have very different responses to that situation. And the key to actually creating sustainable change in our attitude and beliefs and emotions is really to understand those core thought processes that we implement. I mean, they're so automatic. Every day we're in a situation, we might be sitting in a meeting and our boss or manager says something and it triggers off a feeling or behavior. And we have to understand what's our thought patterns about that, because we're wired to think in a certain way and it feels so fixed often. And what people don't realize is you cannot change the way you think about a situation until you truly understand those automatic thought processes. So that's ideal to recognize what is your cognitive roadmap when you're in a situation. What gets triggered? And often our cognitive roadmap is linked to our previous experiences and relationships. That builds our automatic responses. So it's quite liberating to imagine that we don't always have to change our situation, but we can change how we think about a situation to bring about wellness and just having a better quality of life. So it's quite empowering to know that maybe we can't always change our situation, but we can certainly change the way we react to those situations.
So a lot of managers and recruiters that I talk to tell me that one of the key attributes they look for these days is the ability for people to cope in an atmosphere of uncertainty, having the ability to really thrive in an uncertain environment that would make other people freeze. So what's your opinion on that, Nicky?
I'm very passionate about, the concept of uncertainty and how it impacts on our everyday lives. And I think from my practice in clinical psychology, a lot of people do come for therapy because they are stressed and anxious about the future. And a big part of my therapeutic tools is to help people to learn to tolerate uncertainty. So within a workplace, it also becomes very interesting because it's to recognize how all of us worry about the future. And when we think about that concept of worrying about the future, is that none of us have absolute control over what the future holds. And ultimately, why people find it so hard to tolerate uncertainty is because they place demands on themselves that they have to know exactly what is going to happen. So I think in the corporate world at the moment, people want to know, will I reach my targets? Will there be another recession? What is going to happen in the political landscape of my country? There's so many questions about, wanting to know exactly what's going to happen in the future. So I believe so strongly that when we learn to tolerate that uncertainty, and I mean, ultimately that is to teach yourself to live in the present moment, that if we worry too much about tomorrow, then we cannot enjoy today. So I think recruiters need to ascertain whether applicants really understand that concept, because as much as we want to put in every effort today to make sure that our outcomes are positive and in line with what we're striving for, does that person have that ability to tolerate uncertainty? Does that person have the ability to recognize what the limitations are in going forward into the future, that we can't know, we don't have a crystal ball. So I think that it's a huge skill for us to learn, that we worry about the future. We don't worry about the past. I mean, we tend to dwell on the past sometimes, which can lead to depression. But ultimately, when we understand the ability to tolerate uncertainty, I mean, we can actually achieve so much more in the workplace. And really, worrying is such a waste of time because it gets us nowhere. But also in the same breath, I always feel that we need a little bit of anxiety to motivate us to do the right thing. So don't always think that the best cure for tolerating uncertainty is to have no anxiety at all. I mean, we need to have a little bit of anxiety to be able to be motivated, to be ambitious, and to reach our goals.
Well, it looks like that's all we have time for. So thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insights, Nicky.
Thanks, Hugo, and it's such a privilege to be part of the Big Ideas Summit in Sydney.
Thank you for listening to the Bravo podcast series sponsored by Telstra. This series will be made available in the Procurious Learning section.